Well, I just didn't have my shaft correctly aligned there. It screws in now, that's all good. And the rewind button. Normally I apply a little bit of grease to the synthetic grease to the shaft, not the thread. Pop on the spring, pop on that heavy washer, and this should screw onto the end of that sprocket shaft. And then the only tricky bit is getting the centre of this rewind button to pass through that washer correctly. So sometimes there's a bit of mucking about. That's it. I was checking that clicks and releases nicely. It does. I've got a pair of pliers for doing that up. And thoughtfully, I even had them on hand. Just snug that up. So our rewind button is all in place. Now I can snug up these two screws here, holding the guide bush for our film advance in place, and I'm just going to revolve that with my thumb, the film sprocket, to make sure it all revolves smoothly and that I haven't loaded up this gear, these gears here, that they are not being loaded up and being unusually stiff because of that. That's good. That's working fine. What do I do next? What do I need? I think we just about put the cover plate on the base of the camera next. So I'll zoom back out a bit. And find the base. I've got a cutaway base for doing this model, and it's handy to help keep everything in place, particularly the return spring for that mirror. So I'll pop my lock lever to one side, pull back my release lever, and I'll rotate this whole shaft clockwise one full turn and drop my lock lever back down in place to hold it there so it doesn't get away. Now I've got one turn of tension, or slightly more than one turn of tension on that film advance. It means that the film advance will return to the rest position smoothly. Now I need my spring for the mirror, so I'll find that. It was this little one. On the later Retina Reflexes, the S3 and 4, they used a much finer spring in that position, presumably slightly lower tension. I'll put this cover plate in place. Now this is handy for me to use when I'm servicing things. Its main feature is that it doesn't cover the front of the camera. It gives me more wriggle room to get the front of the camera in place. And when you're trying to get the front on a Retina Reflex, the more wriggle room you've got, the better. You can assemble the camera without this piece in place. That little spring there, for example, you can deal with that by putting it in place and putting a piece of tape across the top to stop it from escaping. And that certainly works, and that's a technique I've used in the past until I got tired of it and repurposed a damaged base plate. This allows me to fit the advance lever, and once the advance lever is fitted, I can't lose the spring tension on the film advance shaft that we put there, because the advance lever can't go back over the body. So 2 screws is more than enough to hold that in place. Now I can check the action of my film advance. Press down on the film release lever, it should click into place. Hold my finger on the lock lever shaft at the top, which is the same function that the film counter would give you, the frame counter, when anything up at number 1. And I can rotate my film advance. I'm checking that it moves smoothly. There's no binding. Then my film release lever pops back into position when I get to the end of the forward stroke. And clicks down into position firmly when I press on the top, which moves the film release lever to the lower side of the cam. So that part's good. The base of the camera is basically dealt with for the moment. We don't need to do any more with that. At the top of the camera, my next task is to put back the chrome trim, put the rewind knob in place. I'll put that post there that holds the top cover. We can fit the cocking rack, get all that in place, clamp down and check the action of that, noting that there was a shim under that clamp when I took the camera apart, which may or may not be useful, and we'll see how we get on with that. Right, so I'll get my bits and pieces all ready for the next part. Okay, to putting the chrome trim back on the top of the camera body. It's just been cleaned. It doesn't require much cleaning. There's not much to really go wrong with that. There's only a single screw that we need to put back at this stage. The matching screw at this end is the holds down the meter, so that doesn't go until much later. Okay, well, I think the rewind knob could go on next, so I'll just assemble that. There's not much to rewind knobs. We have the inner, that is a little spring around the centre, which provides some controlled friction. So that the knob doesn't flop around when you're trying to do things. Here's the bush that has a little leaf spring inset into a groove on the inside, so I'm just applying a bit of grease there. That should fit on. Now basically this should revolve round relatively smoothly. It doesn't need to be free running like a wheel. When it's in its rest position is there. It'll obviously have more resistance when you pull it up, as you would do to put the film cartridge in. Otherwise it's always operating in this position. That can pop into the top of the casting. There are 2 countersunk or flathead screws hold that in place. As usual, get all the screws in place, then tighten them up. We have our strap lug at the end of the camera, and the strap lug I can see is slightly bent. It's got a curve here. It shouldn't have a curve there, so I will find some pliers and I'll return that to the proper shape. Of course, the pliers I was looking for, I realised I'd taken them away to do some other task, so I'll use some different pliers. And I want to be reasonably careful here not to mark the chrome. I'll just give that a squeeze at both ends. And now this comes up in more of a straight line there instead of a bend, and it closely matches at both ends, so that's all that's required. And that is held in with 2 screws, and the 2 screws will be that one and its mate. Are they the same length? Yes, they are. Good. So I'll pop that in place. Once again, get both screws in position. Then I'm making sure that I'm pushing this bracket towards the end of the camera and that it's against the heads of both screws, nice and square. I can do up those screws. So our strap lug's in position, our rewind shaft is all in position. I can pop this support for the top cover in position, and there's a couple of ways you can tighten that. It's got a fine groove in the top. I'll just bark a tool through there, just tweak it up, since I don't have a narrow bladed screwdriver as wide as that, and it doesn't need to be particularly tight, it can't go anywhere. Alright, so our top is in place, and the next thing we need to worry about is the cocking rack and its associated pieces. So I'll start with the cocking rack, and first I'm going to inspect it closely to make sure that the teeth aren't distorted. It's not perfect, but it's more than good enough for our purposes. So I'll apply some grease to the cocking rack. Again, I'm using that synthetic grease. And pop that in place. That looks about right. We have a thick black washer arrangement here. That's the rack runs against this. I'm just putting a bit of molybdenum down the centre of that. That sits in this position. Of course, I'll keep moving off camera so you can't see a thing. There's a special screw that goes down in there. It's a countersunk screw, but it's got a broader piece just under the head that locates that black bush and effectively acts as a pivot for it if it rotates. I don't think it does rotate. It's good. We should have a single screw for the end of that strap bracket here. It's a panhead screw. And then there's this bracket that holds down the rack. Since I've run that through the degreaser and cleaner, it will have no lubricant in there at all. There's like a small rotating bush here. I'm just going to force some grease into there, much as you would do to pack a wheel bearing on an old car, if anyone remembers that. Our bracket fits this way. Now, I said normally there'd be a longer screw in that position, and that's certainly true, but I noticed when I tested it to see if I could fit a longer screw down there, there really wasn't any depth of thread or depth in the hole even in order to enable that. Alright, so that's in position. Now I'm going to check to see if I've got the cocking rack correctly placed. If I had it one tooth out, it might butt up against the trim at the end. You wouldn't be able to complete the advanced stroke. If I had it one tooth back this way, chances are it wouldn't stay correctly engaged with the film advance shaft at the top. Now that all moved very smoothly. I'm just going to tighten those screws up holding that clamp plate down. So the only variable here now in terms of that bracket that had their shim under it originally is if I discovered that once the transfer shaft and everything was in place that there was some stiffness to the film advance, then that might indicate that that there was insufficient clearance between the rack and the gear on the end of that transfer shaft here, in which case a shim would be indicated. But at the moment I don't know about that for sure. Fairly frequently cameras, when they are first assembled, might require shims to provide some clearance in places, but after they've been used for some time, enough clearance develops naturally that the shims are no longer required or beneficial in any way at all. So film advance is working nicely. The camera body is basically ready at this stage to have the transfer shaft put back in place and the front of the camera put back on. So that's the next thing I want to prepare for. I was just looking at the transfer shaft or cam here, and I can see that there's an adjustment screw on here, and that's intended to make fine adjustments to the position of the cocking of the shutter components at the front. And I see that it's pretty much wound right out past its normal adjustment range, which suggests to me that something wasn't correctly placed when this was installed previously. So I'm going to back that screw out, hopefully, and start it off in the neutral position and then make adjustments to it as required and if required. There's a little bit of lacquer left sitting on here that hasn't come off in the cleaning process. I'll lift that off now. I wouldn't normally expect to have to adjust that by that amount, and it suggests that something else was not correctly assembled previously. I'm going to fit the transfer shaft cam in place. So I'm just putting a bit of molybdenum on there. It's one of the hardest words to say, molybdenum. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Apply a little bit of synthetic grease on the gear at the back. Pop that into place. It looks correctly positioned. I'll just check that. Let's just latch my mirror down out of the way. That looks correct. We have the gear for the front. That also acts as a cam which releases various things as it rolls round with the mirror and capping plate and so forth. So I'm just applying a bit of molybdenum to the inside and around the cam surface at the outside, and drop this into place. I have to lift up this spring-loaded arm to get it into place, and that's rotated round to its start position at that point. So now we're just about ready to fit the front part of the camera housing. So that's my next task. Alright, before I refit the camera front, I'll just remove this screw from the top of the chrome trim to make it easier to lift the chrome trim back over the front component. So I'm making sure that my front cam here is rotated clockwise as far as it will go against the main cam. I'm going to make sure that my capping plate is clipped down into place. Excuse me. Right, before I was so rudely interrupted by the doorbell, what was I doing? I was saying about this. Capping plate, make sure it's clipped down into place. The mirror, leave it floating. We'll have to press that down into place as we install the front. It has to be done at the right time. So our front, basically we've got our shutter release arm here. That needs to run on that crossbar here over the top of it. So I'll put that in place, put the bottom of the front section into the cavity, put my tweezers in here and lift the chrome trim back to allow me to drop the front back slightly. Now here I've probably got about 6mm of space under here, quarter an inch. I'm putting my tweezers in and then just moving the mirror down to make sure it goes underneath the lip on that front section. That's good. That happened. Without disturbing that, I'll pop the two bottom screws into the front section here. I just want to get those screws started. It's just to stop that plate moving away. I only need a turn and a half perhaps. Looking from the top, our gear at the top here is obviously out of position. It's sitting too high. I've got to wriggle that into place. So I wriggle that into place, and I still haven't engaged it with the front section yet. What I need to do is advance the position of that cam on the front section. It's already dropped into place in the wrong spot. I'll just lift that back out. I want to bring this curved section around about a tooth in distance, I would say, before I engage it. So I'm just doing that with the point of my tweezers. Squeeze the front closed, press down the film release button, hold down the lock button, and as soon as I moved that film advance lever, it dropped into place. It's engaged. And I'm just checking that the mirror did in fact lock down into position, and then pushing my screwdriver down in the shutter release hole, I could see that released the shutter. So at this point, this is at the rest position. Those alignment marks that I said somebody had scraped across there, they're pretty much aligned at exactly that point. I'll zoom you in a bit. I'll pop a couple of screws in the top here so this doesn't get lost. Unlike the Retina Reflex S and later reflexes, there are no washers between the front section and the housing, the main housing. They're simply screwed back home hard. Alright, in the front section here, I'll zoom you in. Now I'll just push the film release, and you'll see as I cock that, you'll see that pin here rolls up against the end. It can only go so far, it hits that screw head. If it goes too far, it hits the screw head. It can't complete the stroke. I'm pretty confident I've got the positioning correct there. At the very worst, I'll be one tooth out. I don't think I am. And if I need to make a slight adjustment, of course I have the adjustment screw on the main transfer shaft, and certainly it's backed out at the moment, so I've got plenty of room there to adjust it to give us a little bit of extra action at the front if so needed. But at the moment I'm quite happy with that. I think that if the shutter was refitted at that point, that would probably work fine. So here I'll pop that loose screw back into the chrome trim. And I think I can pop the one in the front there too for good measure, since I'm feeling pretty confident. That one's slightly damaged looking. I think I made a comment about that when I took the camera apart. That's good. So basically that's the main components of the body complete now. And at this stage I would do no more to the body until I have the shutter cleaned and reassembled and then tested in the body. And then I would refit the prism, the chrome trim at the base, the leatherettes, and otherwise close up the camera. So the next task is to do the shutter.